Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this afternoon's webinar, MISO South Past Lessons and Future Implications. During the course of this webinar, we're going to be taking a look at the first year of MISO South, so from that December 19th, 2013 integration until the start of 2015. As always, if you have a question, please feel free to use the GoToWebinar question box, and we'll be happy to address those questions at the end of today's presentation. So just a quick agenda here. First, we're going to take a look at the changes in the barriers to trading. About a year ago, the MISO team presented a very similar outlook for what we are seeing as hindrances to trading in the new region, and we're going to take a look at how those have changed over the past year. From there, we're going to move to looking at price drivers in MISO South, again starting with the year-end prices and looking at each of the three hubs in MISO South, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas hub. And then we're going to take a look at the top 5 MISO South only constraints. And that's going to exclude any of these seams management constraints that we've seen over the course of the year. That will lead us directly, though, into a conversation about from ORCA to power balance and how we've been seeing the changes in flow management in that region. We're then going to take a look at the impact and the future implications for what we might see moving forward. Lastly, we're going to touch upon the MISOISPP disputes and kind of check in and see where we are now. So starting with the barriers to trading, I'm pleased to report that the barriers of trading have been reduced. Last year, upon the initial integration on December 19th, we were looking at several barriers to trading. These kind of boil down to 3 main pain points. The first was a lack of available transmission map. We're also looking at a limited kind of space in terms of contract activity, especially on ICE and other exchanges. And lastly, we were looking at a lack of understanding of price drivers in the region. And this really kind of limited some participation from market participants who normally dealt in MISO Classic from a risk management perspective. However, 1 year on, all of these have pretty much been addressed. A MISO South transmission map now exists from MISO, but it does require a non-disclosure agreement. ICE contracts for the MISO South J-HUD hubs has been created as of September 2014. And then again, with 1 year's worth of pricing under our belts, we are seeing some participants move in as they're able to kind of see patterns emerging in the South region. So now moving into those patterns and understanding what we saw drive prices in the past year. Starting with Arkansas Hub and looking at the prices based on season, as you can see, we had a lot of volatility in the first 2 seasons, winter and spring, and then saw that volatility start to die down summer and then more so in this most recent fall. There will be a couple reasons why we think we saw these stronger levels of volatility in winter and spring, and we'll address that a little later in the presentation. But to just put some numbers on these graphs, you're looking at an average Arkansas Hub start spread at about 93-cent premium in the real time. And what that boiled down to, on-peak versus off-peak. On the on-peak, you're looking about a $1 premium to the real time, as opposed to a $3 premium in the off-peak. Now looking at the congestion component of that, the average dart spread was about $1.75 there. Now just looking at the dam for comparison, the average dam clear for a 24-hour period was around $37, the on-peak around $41, the off-peak cheaper at $31. The highest day-ahead clear occurred on March 4th during RNing 8, and we were looking at a clear of just under $183. For that same time period in the day ahead, we saw the MCCs clear on average close to about 22 cents. Looking at the biggest real-time hour, that occurred, as we all know, during the polar vortex back on January 7th during RNing 8. What we were seeing there were real-time undercommitment issues, and again, this is driven by extremely cold conditions across the footprint. And again, we'll see this come back up as we look at some of the other hubs. Moving on to Louisiana Hub now. Again, you're seeing a similar volatility level between winter and spring, and then that beginning to taper off as we moved into summer and fall. The summer volatility is there, as you would expect, but again, not to the same degree or magnitude that we were seeing over winter and spring. So again, just to go through some quick statistics here, on average, we saw Louisiana hub clear close to about $2 stronger in the real time versus the day ahead. Breaking that between on and off, that put about a $3 premium on real time and a 60-cent premium in the off-peak on real time. The average MCC dart spread was about $2.50, again toward the real time. On average of the day ahead, that Louisiana day ahead clear a little bit stronger than Arkansas, coming in close to $39.50. The on-peak stronger still at $44.78, and the off-peak at $34.80. The highest day ahead clear was around $2.27, and that occurred later in January 2014 during our ending 8. A little bit more congestion activity on Louisiana hub relative to Arkansas, and that MCC day ahead clear coming in about $1.28. Now looking at the biggest real-time hour for Louisiana hub, it is a little surprising that it wasn't the polar vortex, and this is the only one out of the 3 hubs that wasn't looking at the polar vortex for the biggest real-time hour. And that hour was on April 23rd during hour ending 21, when prices shot up to about $2,300 per megawatt hour. During this time, we were seeing very heavy evening congestion around Addis to Tiger, with 2 different forms of that constraint binding, along with congestion at Bogalusa to Barker's Corner and Fancy Point Transformer. I would point out that each of those constraints was binding at a maximum shadow price level of either $1,000 or $2,000. And then lastly, moving to Texas hub, again seeing the same kind of macro trend of a more volatile winter and spring, and then starting to die down as we moved into summer and fall. Now Texas hub is the strongest prices of all of the 3 hubs in MISO South. However, you'll see that there's actually a little bit of a day-ahead premium on the on-peak period in Texas, whereas we were seeing a real-time premium across the board on the other 2 hubs. The average dart spread about 11 cents to the real time, but as I mentioned, on-peak 34 cents to the day-ahead, and off-peak 55 cents to the real time. Looking at the average MCC dart spread, or about 83 cents, again, premium in the real time. Dam clear-wise, you're still looking at the strongest pricing there at a $44.97. Off-peak, that was around $39, whereas the on-peak came in closer to $51. The highest day-ahead clear for Texas hub occurred on May 23rd during hour ending 17 and came in close to about $450. Looking at the congestion cost as a component of the day-ahead clear, that was close to $650. So again, indicating a lot more congestion activity on Texas hub relative to what we saw on Louisiana and Arkansas. Lastly, as I've mentioned already, polar vortex really kind of driving the peak pricing for the 2 out of 3 hubs for the past year. A little surprising that it wasn't kind of summer related, even though we did see summer peaks come in stronger than we saw even during the polar vortex. I will point out just one note that the peak demand overall for this system occurred in August, whereas peak demand for the entire footprint occurred back on July 22nd. So again, just kind of interesting that we saw polar vortex conditions on top of a new transition really starting to drive those stronger real-time prices relative to typical expectations where you're looking at your strongest pricing around your summer peak day. So now moving on to congestion and what we're seeing there. Since December 19th, we've been close to about 400 new individual constraints in MISO South. And that was out of about 1,200 real-time constraints total within the footprint. So if you're thinking about MISO South load representing about 1/3 of your total MISO demand, again, kind of comes out as about 1/3 of your congestion. Many of these constraints, again, were different variations of a couple consistent congestion patterns throughout the region. Looking at top binding constraints as they stood as single constraints, our top 5 real-time constraints in MISO South, again, barring power balance or ORCA, over the last year as ordered, Addis Tiger, Nelson Transformer, St. Gabriel to AAC Port, Little Gypsy Waterford, and Dumas to Reed. So digging a little bit deeper now into these top 5 constraints, I've kind of put a nice plain English name on the top of the slide and the variation of the real-time binding constraint in the parentheses next to it. So looking at Addis Tiger, looking at drivers there, what we were seeing was an abundance of line work around Willow Glen, particularly over the course of the year at Willow Glen to Brittany. We were also looking at some line work on top of the constraint itself at Addis, and this included Addis to Cohen and Placid to Cohen. Lastly, line work around Evergreen also contributed to this congestion at Evergreen to Donaldsonville. Seasonally, fall is the most active season for this constraint, coming in around 6,700 5-minute real-time intervals. Winter the next at about 2,100, spring at 15, and then the summer only about 800 intervals. So again, fall really kind of being the most active time period for this constraint, watching some of the fall maintenance coming in and helping to drive that, and then again, some of that residual summer heat also playing into it. Lastly, looking at the impact, as you can see on the screen capture to the right, we're seeing a very strong bullish impact towards Louisiana hub. Next up is Nelson Transformer. Looking at drivers here, we are seeing line work around Wells, especially Wells to Weber, as one of the top drivers for this constraint. You're also seeing a Richard to Nelson line outage helping to cause this. In addition to line work, other drivers for this constraint included weak generation output at Nelson itself, along with strong load in Texas. Seasonally, again, looking at spring here being the most active season at about 7,700 intervals. Summer, though, dying down and only just under 2,000. Winter at about 1,100, and then the fall less active at about 500 intervals. Now, again, looking at the screen grab here, a pretty strong downside impact towards Louisiana hub, stronger pricing on Texas hub, and then you're also seeing some upside on the Nelson unit itself. Third, St. Gabriel to AAC Corp. Drivers here, again, Willow Glen Brittany being a strong driver here. You're also looking at line outages a little bit more close to home at Iberville to Shenango, helping to drive that constraint. And lastly, weak output from the Waterford unit. Seasonally, again, we're still seeing these kind of shoulder seasons as more active, with spring at around 3,900, summer closer to 1,100, fall at 130, and winter only seeing 2 intervals of this particular constraint. Looking at impact, you are seeing an upside on both Louisiana hub as well as an upside on the Waterford unit. Moving to Little Gypsy Waterford now. So again, sticking with a lot of top constraints focused around Louisiana and Texas hubs. Drivers here included line work around University City, particularly University City to Snake Farm. You also had line work at Tezuku and weak output from 2 gas-fired units in eastern Louisiana, most notably 9 Mile and Miso. Seasonally, this is one of the top summer constraints, and again related to kind of that gas output at around 3,300 binding intervals in summer, just under 1,000 in fall, winter even less at around 33, and then no binding intervals in spring. Now looking at impact here, you are seeing downside driven on Louisiana hub as well as the Waterford unit, but upside towards those 9 Mile and Miso units. Lastly, the only constraint that we weren't seeing in Louisiana and Texas was this Dumas Reed, and again, the only Arkansas constraint to make the list. Looking here at drivers, we are seeing line work at PB Watson and Woodward, really helping to drive this constraint over the course of the year. We're also seeing weak output from Union and the Andrus units as drivers here. Spring, again, being one of the more active seasons at around 2,800 intervals, and then falling off from there, winter only seeing 6, and then summer and fall both at 0. Now again, just wrapping up the impacts here, you're seeing upside to all of the MISO South hubs, so Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. You're also seeing upside toward the Andrus unit, but downside back towards that cluster of hydro in western Arkansas. Now moving on from the top kind of transmission binding constraints over to from ORCA to sub-regional power balance. So over the course of the year, we saw a lot of changes in flow management as MISO tried to deal with the 1,000 megawatt physical tie line between MISO South and MISO Classic. So early in the year, MISO used the ORCA flow gates, ORCAs 1, 2, and 3, to help manage flows between MISO South and MISO Classic. However, this was seen as ineffectual as it was using a transmission constraint in order to help serve a generation to load issue. So by April, this led to the creation of a new generation of load constraint, and MISO went back and redefined congestion to kind of accommodate this. And they renamed it sub-regional power balance, which again addressed that issue of generation imbalance within the MISO pool. As I mentioned, sub-regional power balance congestion went into effect as of April 12th. And since going live, real-time power balance congestion has flowed north to south 41% of the time, which is a little surprising when you reflect back on what MISO was looking at prior to the integration, where they were assuming that MISO South would have a generation surplus and help to really kind of flow more into MISO Classic, where there's a little bit more of a threat of coal retirements, which may draw that power in. Again, as of 41% of the time, that was close to about 200,000 5-minute intervals. And looking at day-ahead flows between north and south following a similar pattern. Now, 41%, and if you do the math, 60%, I will say that the south to north flows came in close to about 30% of the time, and then the other percentage was a none kind of binding set. Now again, looking at south, the power balance, ORCA congestion really has tapered off as a trade-off and as it was designed to do. Since the incorporation of sub-power balance, ORCA has only posted 2,200 times over the course of the last 8 months. Now to put that in perspective, you're like, this is still binding. Before the change, ORCA congestion posted almost 8,500 times in the first 4 months. So again, we're seeing the mitigation come in, especially as we move into those kind of summer and more so into the fall season. And this is part of what we think was driving the decrease in volatility in the MISO South Hub prices from integration until now. We think that looking at the power balance constraint and the better management around that really helped to kind of limit some of the volatility we were seeing. And again, just to kind of have a visual representation here, this is how we were seeing actual power flows throughout the MISO footprint come in over the course of 2014. So you're seeing a push from the kind of renewables-rich areas in Minnesota and Iowa, moving south and eastward, some of that moving into MISO South, and then some of that further moving eastward into Indiana and Illinois. So looking at the predictability of that flow direction, so how, looking at this as a market participant, do you know which direction to expect those flows to come in? So looking at both cases of ORCA and sub-regional power balance, there are several indicators that we're looking which help predict the direction of the flow. Starting off with temperature spreads between Chicago and New Orleans. This is particularly effective during the colder winter months where you start to see a pretty significant spread. When you're looking at the summer, though, the entire footprint starts looking pretty warm, and that spread doesn't look quite as wide. So what do we use if we're not looking at that temperature spread as a great indicator? The next thing that we're looking at here are the wind generation expectations in Classic. We do see a correlation on the strong wind days in MISO Classic and seeing flows and PJM. The purpose of the market-to-market coordination is to create more efficient redispatch solutions for reciprocal coordinate flow gates, or those constraints that we see bind in both RTOs, so constraints like Fulton and Ireton. Again, this will also result in more consistent pricing of that congestion between the two markets to get to a better economic solution. Again, this would also create a better and improved mechanism for compensation to deal with those constraints for assets across both regions. And as I mentioned, this is the same method used currently between MISO and PJM. So again, in summary, looking at real-time prices, generally above the day-ahead with the exception of Texas Hub. And again, Texas Hub having a pretty decent premium above the other two. Looking back to the polar vortex of January of last year, we saw some of the strongest pricing occur in the real time for each of those three hubs. And again, just looking for any further kind of risk of that undercommitment in the system due to cold. Top 5 constraints over the course of 2014 included Addis Tiger, Nelson Transformer, St. Gabriel, Little Gypsy Waterford, and UMass Reed. Again, power balance so far has typically flowed north to south, and that pattern is sustained at nearly a 2-to-1 ratio over the summer. And again, barring any significant deviations from normal for summer 2015, we expect to see this trend continue. And lastly here, MISO and SPP continue to work on seams issues, which may dictate future rule changes that continue to shape the MISO South region and its connection to Classic. If we went from ORCA to power balance in the course of 4 months, we're kind of looking forward to see what 2015 and the FERC decisions will shape flows between those two regions in the next couple of years. But that concludes the webinar for the moment. We did see a couple of questions come in, and I'll be happy to address those. So hang on for just a second while I take a look, and we'll be right back. So the first question we got here asked whether or not sub-regional power balance congestion is a demand-driven constraint. As it's a generation to load imbalance constraint, I would say that it is. It's definitely not the typical transmission constraint where you're seeing loading on the line causing congestion. This is more to a gen to load imbalance. The next question we had was whether or not we were seeing hubs in MISO Classic impacted by the power balance constraint. Looking at the way those come in and the way power balance was designed, the pricing impact only occurs on the MISO South hubs and MISO South points. And the points, for the most part, have a shared shift factor. So when that constraint binds, you're actually seeing a similar MCC, or excuse me, the same MCC for all points in MISO South. This is with a couple notable exceptions. One of the most notable is the SPP interface. Because the SPP interface borders both MISO Classic and MISO South, we actually see a prorated level of MCCs on this SPP interface, or SWPP as MISO calls it, when that price comes in. But again, the premium, because we were seeing that north to south primary flow, was on the South hubs. The next question we were seeing, and looking at the ICE liquidity, the first question we had was if we were seeing an increase since September. And again, we're still seeing limited liquidity across the contracts that are available on ICE for MISO South. But again, they are fairly new, only starting in September. So continue to kind of monitor those and see if we see an increase in this coming year. So just to clarify, the one question we just had was how we ranked the top 5 constraints. And those were based on 5-minute real-time binding intervals for that specific constraint name that was included in the slide. Again, we do see kind of those patterns as I mentioned, so we do see a couple different ways for Addis Tiger to bind as well as Little Gypsy Waterford. But as individual standalone constraints, those were the top 5 over the course of 2014. The next question we have was whether or not market-to-market coordination will have any impact on prices on Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, or any specific impacts for MISO South in general. What we're seeing there is that market-to-market will likely limit the impact of some of the common interface constraints that we've been seeing, such as the Fulton and Ireton. Both of those constraints generally have an upside impact on the 3 hubs. So if we see less of those constraints coming in, you may see less of a high side impact on those 3 constraints moving forward. The next question we had was what was one of the more common constraints that we saw that wasn't transmission outage driven and wasn't power balance. What we were seeing, especially over the summer, was Greenwood congestion, Greenwood transformer on that Mississippi border coming in. And again, what we were seeing was strong output from gas in Mississippi, trying to push and serve load towards Louisiana and southern Arkansas. So again, this is something we're also watching for in 2015. The next question we got was what were the biggest impacts on SPP congestion since the integration? Some of what we've been seeing, and this goes in line with what I was saying with the Arkansas 1 nuke coming offline. When we were seeing that, we were seeing an increase in congestion along the border around Fort Smith. So I would say that looking at that congestion as kind of a proxy, we were seeing some downside towards the SPP interface and seeing that congestion also bind in SPP itself. So I think that would be one of them, is that kind of congestion coming on in the more western portions of MISO South on that kind of border between the 2 regions. The last question we have was whether or not market-to-market will have any impact on power balance. We're thinking that it's unlikely that we see any of the power balance really thrown off by the market-to-market coordination. Again, because power balance represents an internal gen-to-load imbalance within the MISO footprint, whereas the market-to-market will be more of those, again, as I just mentioned, the western MISO South constraints coming in, and that, again, might limit some of that volatility we see on the 3 pricing hubs. So that looks like that's it for questions right now. Again, thank you for joining, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the slides will be made available to anybody who registered. Thank you for joining. Happy Mardi Gras to those of you down in MISO South, and we'll look to see you on the next webinar. Have a good afternoon.